Hard-nosed, no-nonsense investigative journalist Lee Strobel was a hardcore atheist until he decided to look into the evidence for the resurrection by interviewing absolutely no one else but evangelical Christian scholars. Ha! What a coincidence! Let's take a look at Lee Strobel's 4 proofs for the resurrection and see if he can't manage to polish a turd.
I like to look at the evidence for the resurrection in 4 categories. The first one is, did Jesus die on the cross? Was he dead?
Did Jesus die on the cross? No trivial point here. And seeing as I am an atheist and I'm rooting against Christianity, I'm going to be a contrarian here and argue that no, being crucified did not kill him. He survived the cross, he was fine, he was good, he got up, dusted himself off, and felt right as rain. He was good. He was good.
Virtually every scholar on planet Earth concedes that Jesus was dead after crucifixion. We have no record of anyone anywhere ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion.
Ooh, that's not a good start for me here. This is not my best.
Even the Journal of the American Medical Association published a peer-reviewed scientific medical study of the evidence for the death of Jesus and said clearly the weight of the evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted.
That's just medical science. I only pay attention to science when I feel like it favors my point of view. Otherwise, I just disregard it. Look, hey, I'll bet you the atheist scholars absolutely deny that the crucifixion killed the guy. I'll bet they're with me. They're probably saying he lived, he's good, he was fine, got up, good. They're on my side.
Even the atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann says historically it's indisputable that Jesus was dead. So Jesus was dead.
Kind of getting my ass kicked here, I'm not gonna lie. It's not good. It's not going well. This is it's bad. It's real bad. Alright, so all joking aside, yes, the crucifixion probably killed him. I'm with you on this, Lee. So glad we agree. 2 points for you, buddy. Happy day, Jesus died. Let's move on.
The second category of evidence is the early accounts we have for the resurrection. In other words, I used to think as an atheist that the resurrection was a legend, and that took a long time to develop in the ancient world. But what I learned is that we have preserved for us a creed of the earliest Christian church, a creed that is an eyewitness-based report of the resurrection of Jesus.
The creed in 1 Corinthians 15, where Jesus appeared to James and 500 of the brothers and Peter and lastly to Paul himself, yada, yada, yada. Eyewitness report, says Lee. Look, the creed is certainly pre-Pauline because Paul is passing on something that he himself received, but frankly, we don't know when Paul received this creed. It was at some point within the 20-year span between Jesus' death and Paul's writing of his letters. Apologists like Lee Strobel and others like to surmise that Paul must have received this creed from Peter and James whenever he went and visited them some years after his conversion in Jerusalem, but this is sheer surmise. He does not tell us this. We don't know when or where he actually received this creed, and there's certainly no evidence that this is written by eyewitnesses. But yeah, just feel free to make shit up, Lee.
Now, this creed has been dated back by scholars to within months of the death of Jesus. Within months. That is historical gold.
Yeah, more like historical conjecture, for which there is no direct evidence. But Lee Strobel's confidence in this matter is certainly a big serving of comedy gold.
Third category of evidence is the empty tomb. And the best evidence for that is even the opponents of Jesus implicitly admitted the tomb was empty. Because when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the opponents said was, oh, well, the disciples stole the body.
Yeah, so Matthew tells us that Jews simply charged that the body had been stolen, and that was their explanation for why the tomb was found empty. We don't actually know whether this is truly a historical fact or datum, or whether this is just something that Matthew himself is creatively making up. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Jews had really said this. More than likely, it's in response to the tradition that had already been well established as early as Mark's gospel some decade earlier, that the body had gone missing or the tomb was found empty. It's hardly evidence that Jews actually knew for a fact that there was an empty tomb. The ultimate purveyor of apologetic bullshit, William Lane Craig, makes up a dialogue in his own head and then commits it to paper that Christians merely said Jesus was raised, and then the automatic initial response from the Jews was, no, 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 his body had been stolen. And this is supposed to be like the smoking gun. The Jews are implicitly admitting that the tomb had been found empty. Never mind the fact that Craig is getting this from the innermost regions of his own ass. Craig simply asserts without evidence that that is in fact what the Jews would have said to the mere claim, the proclamation that Jesus was raised. This is absolute ad hoc, total sleight of hand from a guy who we've seen do this time and time again, and no surprise here. The odd thing is, if a tomb had actually been discovered empty, the body discovered having gone missing. Odd that the Apostle Paul never mentions this. And Paul is more than happy to offer up an apologetic for the resurrection, such as he does when he offers the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. That's what he's doing, is he's making a defense, an apologetic for the resurrection, so why not mention the empty tomb? What apologists try to do here is they say that, well, Paul does mention that Jesus was buried, and if Paul believes that he had been bodily raised, then wherever it was that he was buried, whether an actual tomb or just a cist grave, must have been left vacant in Paul's mind. I agree with that. The problem here is they're equivocating, because that's not quite the same thing as a tomb having actually been found, discovered, empty, as someone actually coming upon a missing body. They are reading that into Paul's statement, which is just, again, pure ad hocery. There's no evidence for this in Paul, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is when such evidence should be expected. If Paul is concerned with apologetics for the resurrection, then why not mention that people had actually discovered the tomb empty, the body missing? Time to rationalize some more bullshit, guys. But just to be nice, I'll even throw in a bonus for hacks like Lee Strobel and William Lane Craig. They argue that in Mark's gospel, it's women who discover the tomb empty. This must be an actual historical datum, a stubborn fact of reality, because women's testimony was so widely distrusted in the ancient world that Mark could not possibly think to mention this unless he was just stuck with the brute fact of women having been the first on the scene. Right. Here's the deal. Yeah, there was misogyny in the ancient world. We actually do have ancient authors like Josephus who speak very misogynistically and in a very demeaning manner about women and their testimony. The problem is, this was not by any stretch the general attitude toward women or toward women's testimony. And the most shining example of this is none other than the New Testament. Romans 16 has Paul speak very highly in a very esteemed manner of women and their leadership roles in the church. So does the book of Acts. And John chapter 4:39 tells us of a woman's testimony having actually convinced a whole slew of Samaritans. Christians were relatively progressive for their time and place in history, and they deserve credit for that. But this nonsense about somehow women being the first at the tomb being a total embarrassment is contradicted by the New Testament itself. They love to keep repeating this absolutely ad hoc, ridiculous argument, even though it's been debunked time and time and time again. And the reason they do it is because they're silly. And last but not least, the fact that these missing body apotheosis type tropes were so popular in the ancient Mediterranean world, in the Greco-Roman world from which Christianity emerged, with myths concerning Romulus, Aristeus, Heracles, you name it. Anytime a body went missing or a tomb was found empty, it signified that the divine man had somehow been divinized, deified, or apotheosized and taken up into the heavenly realm. Is it merely a coincidence that we find it in the New Testament at this very time and place in history when this is a prevailing motif? I think not. But yeah, go ahead, apologists. Just ignore that fact, and I will continue to laugh in your fucking face.
That goes to the fourth category of evidence, which is eyewitnesses. You know, for most of what we know about ancient history, it comes from one or maybe two sources of information. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. That is an avalanche of historical data.
That is an avalanche of moldy dick cheese. That we have multiple sources concerning the same legend that's being promulgated from one group or person to another is completely unsurprising. And a lot of these sources are interdependent, not independent, such as with the whole Pauline corpus. These are various authors within a Pauline school of thought. And the Gospels are certainly not independent. They are interdependent, beginning with Mark, which is passed on to both Matthew and Luke, and finally John. This is entirely unsurprising and unconvincing. Meanwhile, we have multiple sources concerning the post-mortal appearances of the god Asclepius. We have multiple sources concerning Romulus's appearance to Proculus Julius after his apotheosis or death. Are we about to say that we find these stories just as convincing when they're exactly the same kind of mythotype? And of course, the apologist will say, but those stories are so far removed from any so-called event versus Paul's letters and the Gospels, which are so near in proximity to said events. Red herring all the way. The 17th century Messiah figure Sabbatai Sevi had multiple miracle stories spreading about him within his very own lifetime. We still have the letters that actually evidence this. Take Caesar Augustus was thought to have ascended to heaven shortly after his death. That stories crop up very soon after a great leader or king or monumental person's death is entirely unsurprising. This happens all the time. So this is not somehow evidence that makes a special case for Jesus over and above the others. Let's be real. It's the same kind of mythotype. We always judge this to be myth or legend in the other cases, and if you don't, for entirely dubious reasons concerning Jesus, it's mere special pleading, and this whole argument is a red herring, and wow, it's just fallacy upon fallacy upon fallacy. And not a single document in the entire New Testament can be verifiably demonstrated to be written by an actual eyewitness of anything. There are a few places, such as in the beginning of Luke's gospel, where he's basically dedicating this to Theophilus, and he mentions eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Also, a few places in John's gospel where this kind of thing is suggested or implied. We also know that ancient authors, everyone from Herodotus to Philostratus to the author of the letter of Aristeas, loved to use this kind of literary technique to lend verisimilitude to their otherwise fanciful tale, where they claim to either have been eyewitnesses themselves or relied on people who were eyewitnesses, when the story that they're relaying is otherwise entirely fanciful, fabricated, or completely out of left field and is believed by no actual historians. We've got the same kind of thing going on in the New Testament, obviously, and anyone who says otherwise has their head due north up their own butthole.
So you put all that together and you have a really good case for Easter.
Yeah, about as good as a case of herpes. What ought to constitute actual evidence for Jesus having been raised from the dead and immortalized? I submit it ought to be the risen Jesus. That's not at all too demanding. If I tell you that my Uncle Ned has been raised from the dead, you know what you're going to want to see in order to believe me? My risen Uncle Ned. And not a photograph or a video, because you could just as easily say that that has been doctored. No, you're going to want to see Uncle Ned. So why not just bring us the actual risen, immortalized Jesus Christ? Well, it's not quite like that. He's not here anymore. He's upstairs. Of course, that's how you make the belief unfalsifiable. And that's why every single divinity or hero in the ancient world who was said to be raised from death or apotheosized or immortalized was what? Taken upstairs into heaven or upon Mount Olympus, where the naked eye simply could not see anymore. It's just like Carl Sagan's dragon. He's invisible. Nah, you can't throw your lunch on him and make it stick. That's not going to work. No, you have to have. It's all such. Yeah, but you know what? Lee did make a good case for Jesus having died. Sadly, Lee, I think he stayed that way, bub.